good to see everyone here. Wonderful to have this session with you. My name is Hung Lee, and I'm going to be moderating this conversation on mastering the skills economy, presented by our friends at Worksome. This is going to be a really educational show, and I mentioned to the guys sort of earlier today that I was excited to be here because I'm going to be educated. Two really kind of independent concepts have kind of converged to us. Number one, the rise of alternative workforce. We know that companies need to hire more than just full-time employees. We need to look at different types of worker, irrespective of their contractual relationship with the organization. That's definitely been an interest from the C-level, really pre-COVID. Gives us more organizational agility, able to scale up, scale down. And secondly, we have this idea of skills-based hiring. We need to hire people not necessarily for their experience or their credentials, should we say, but actually on their job performance, what they can actually do. And those two things, I think, dovetail quite well together, given the fact that alternative workers, particularly freelancers, might have been the first skills-based hires out there. You hired a freelancer principally for a specific function, project, or task. And we almost certainly assess them for a skill rather than overweight their credentials. So those two things have dovetailed. Today, we're going to be discussing exactly what that means, how to set up an operation that makes organizations particularly effective in managing this future workforce. Okay, let's kick off and invite our guests onto the show. We've got Dan DeLord of Dan DeLord Consultancy joining us, and Jacob Williams over at Worksome as well. So let's bring our guests on screen and we'll kick off this session. There you go, guys. I've given you a very brief intro. I wonder whether you could both do us a favor and just introduce yourself actually to the audience. So let's go with you first, Dan. Can you quickly introduce yourself? Who are you? What it is you do?
I'm Dan. I used to head up talent at RGA, who are a global innovation consultancy. For the last 18 months, I've run my own consultancy about helping organizations through a change moment, either around people or people structures. And so a lot of what we're talking about today, either through those two lenses, is very relevant. And I've had the pleasure of being on a number of Worksome events now and sat opposite Jake.
Fantastic stuff. You must have done a good job, Dan, to be a repeat guest. The bar is actually raised with that last comment, Dan. Wonderful to have you on the show. We have Jacob here as well. Quickly, Jacob, who you are and what it is you do?
Yeah, so I'm at Worksome, so I'm the Director of Talent Solutions here. My previous roles have all been in talent acquisition. So for the past decade, I've been a TA leader working across advertising businesses and various other industries too. So, I kind of see things from both sides of the fence, right? Having working with our clients here at Worksome, but having also been a client too.
Fantastic stuff. Okay, excellent stuff. Dan, let's dive into it. Let's not make any presumptions as to what people know about the skills economy, skills-based hiring. Can you give us your definition of what this is and why is it different from what it is before? Were we always hiring for skills? That's a rejoinder I've always heard. So how would you define skills-based hiring and why is it a break from what we were doing before?
Well, I know you set the scene, Hung, but I think it's sort of important to keep adding to that context a bit. There is, in the current market, a discrepancy between the talent supply and demand. There's a growing skills gap. There's high costs of employment for employers. And as you said, you've got more individuals entering the market, different forms of engagement because of organizational budget constraints. So there's quite a lot of challenges in there already. And to start to try and address those, we're seeing a shift from looking at an individual's value from simply just traditional credentials like job titles or previous experience or educational qualifications, and looking at skills, which essentially is an ability to perform a task with demonstrable proficiency as a way as that being more important to individual performance or business outcome. So I think it's always been there. but I think there's been a bias towards looking for what you know, and what you feel is, in inverted commas, less risk averse for making a decision around hiring. But I think you're now getting to a view of actually measuring someone's ability to do X rather than their measuring a proxy for their ability to do X. So from the organization's point of view, it's looking at what does it mean to be able to do this job. You're going much more focused in on that. So I think it's an exciting time to kind of be considering this point. I think there's a number of reasons why that adds value for TA and HR professionals, like you talked about earlier. There's that agility piece, so organizations can adapt to the market and to talent scarcity. There's efficiency, so you kind of look at the process and reduce mishiring. Equity, looking at broader talent pools and diversifying hiring. But there's also things like engagement, and you start to build that culture of continuous learning and reskilling. So you take all those things together, skills-based hiring can and should, I suppose, work across the whole talent lifecycle, not just through recruiting, but actually during people's experiences in the organization.
Yeah, I think it's a gateway towards things like internal mobility, and then it makes sense, of course, for L&D, personal development, to be fully embedded into all of that story of an individual flowing through a business. Very interesting. Indeed. Staying with you, Dan, just temporarily, you mentioned that you recently worked with the RGA, and you're doing a lot of consultancy work as well. So I'd be interested to know, what sort of practical application or implementation, should we say, associated with skills-based hiring that you've got some experience of. There's some people here listening to this and thinking, this sounds great, Dan, but what is it? How does it manifest? In the day-to-day work of recruiting. So have you got any examples or cases that can help illustrate that?
Yeah, I've been doing some stuff in the consulting side, but I think I'll talk to the RGA days, and I think I'll caveat that by saying all the stuff that I've done has not yet gone fully across the talent life cycle. So I feel like myself, many organizations have started to look at this, but it's kind of early days. You've got obviously process and operational change, but you've also got behavior and thinking change. So it's a big thing to look at. So it can be a bit difficult or a bit scary to know where to start or how to begin. One thing we did at RGA was design a talent center of excellence. So a pillar of that was intentional and inclusive talent attraction, and looking at things like structured behavioral interviews, standardized scoring, pre-dividing skills in each capability that we were looking for, and being very granular about how we measured that, and how we assessed that. Specifically for today, RGA, during my time there, also changed their operating model, moved from much more retained business to more project-based business, and that necessitated a change in the workforce as well. It needed to be much more flexible, have more of an external talent ecosystem as well, rather than carrying everything internally. And that included a skills-based approach to freelance hiring as well. So being very clear on the skills missing from a project, where we were going to source those skills from, how we would assess them, how we'd integrate them. And then obviously with R35, having very individualized scopes around the tasks and the objectives for someone coming into a business. I think you take both of those things, and the key strand that runs through them is probably they're pilots almost, and you can do that at either a particular point of the talent life cycle, or perhaps a particular set of roles like freelance, where skills-based hiring can have an impact. In fact, on freelance, it's such a natural place because there's a very immediate feedback loop. So you get that either there's a recalibration point or there's a proof of what you're doing.
It's the more you kind of sort of explain that, Dan, the more I realize that actually freelance hiring or hiring freelancers exactly is a model as to how skills-based hiring might occur for full-time workers as well. Because typically, I just remember my own experience of hiring somebody from Upwork, let's say, or hiring somebody to do any type of job, even a handyman coming to do some work for you in the house. You're not looking at the guy's CV. You're saying, hey, this is the job, how would you fix it? And then you're looking at the proposition as the person does this, and that's how you go and make the hire. Does a good job, give a good rating, you're going to go call that guy again. Going to you, Jake, on this, skills-based hiring, I mean, are you seeing, for instance, companies that have a large exposure to freelance hiring adopting skills-based hiring more easily? Does that make sense, or have you got any visibility of that?
Yeah, for sure. I think, look, the background that Dan's from in regards to kind of RGA and that more creative advertising agency, companies like that have been doing this for a long, long time, right? They are effectively experts in this field because it's, the way that they've always done things, right? They get a brief from a client, they need to hit that brief, they work out exactly what resource they need. They have specific resource directors that work on this, that build out workforce plans, and then they go to the coalface to go and get that. I think other businesses outside of advertising, I've been having lots of conversations over the past 12 months with other industries, whether it's FMCG, for instance, that are looking at things like blue collar workers that are completely different to advertising and in manufacturing. And it's, applying a skills-based hiring model is something that they were probably already doing from a permanent perspective, right? Hung, you just mentioned it there. There are nothing that we speak around in freelance hiring or skills-based hiring is innovative, really. A lot of this stuff has been going on for a long, long time. It's just about how people now apply a new lens that they have been applying to maybe permanent hiring strategies onto the freelance market and saying, right, okay, how do we tap into this? I think there has been a shift for sure in the past, I want to say 18 months, but I feel like that timeline's always banded around. But I'm definitely seeing more TA leaders and kind of HROs looking into 2025 and saying, right, we've treated skills-based hiring and freelance hiring altogether as plan B. Maybe we need to start using this as plan A and really applying our EVP strategies to this and understanding exactly what that experience looks like in order to benefit the businesses and the projects that we can undertake and really understand what 2025 will look like and where the skills gaps are. So yeah.
Yep, I totally get it, and I love the kind of a shift of mindset. Hiring someone on a non-full-time basis maybe does feel or has seemed like an emergency, like fix type scenario. But in fact, as the world is obviously very unpredictable, it needs to be part of your strategy to be able to rapidly assemble a team or rapidly assemble capacity to deploy it. And we know that hiring on the interim market, freelance market, typically has a much shorter life cycle to hire than shifting someone who might have a long notice period, for instance. So there's obviously perhaps a bigger commitment needed when you're switching to full time. So very interesting indeed. Let's talk about sort of how you would assess a freelancer. And then compare that to how it might apply to a full-time worker. I mean, is it a direct analogy? Can you simply transpose what you would do when you're assessing a freelancer to a full-time hire, or are there other things that we need to consider? I'll throw it open to either of you guys to chip in with this. What are your thoughts? How, I guess, portable is a freelancer optimized assessment approach to full-time hiring?
Yeah, I think just to jump in, Dan, but I think, funnily enough, recruitment is recruitment in many ways, shapes, or form, right? And when it comes to assessment, that can really come down to the role, right? It comes down to what that freelancer is going to be undertaking and the roles and responsibilities that they are going to need. And therefore, how you assess those skills is on a very pragmatic way due to whatever that person will be doing. Whether they're permanent or freelance, I don't really see as I think is a moot point. I think really and truly, the gap between a permanent person in your business and the longevity in which they stay versus a freelancer can sometimes be really, really close together. And I think people forget that, right? There's some businesses out there that have, that have gone through skills-based hiring assessments and they've brought people in for 3 months that have ended up staying there for 2 years, So I think really and truly the kind of dissecting the two, depending on the contract and the type of contract, whether that be permanent or freelance, is kind of a moot point because you're wanting to bring in that talent for a certain reason. So it's about how do you assess that certain reason, whether that is the skill, the project, and the way of working, or the kind of company that they worked with previously. I think it all just blends. And I think that's what we're seeing now is a real blend of the two.
Cool. What are your thoughts, Dan? Like if the person doing this for the first time, they may have hired a few freelancers. They've got this method. Typically, recruiting traditional pipelining at a full-time worker might be different. Do you think you could directly apply the freelance hiring style to full-time recruitment? If so, why do you think that? And if not, what sort of amendments do they need to make?
I think process-wise, like I agree with Jake, it is the same. I think if you're looking at being clear on the skills you need, where you'll find them, how you'll assess them, that is the same whether you're searching for freelance talent or permanent talent. I think there becomes a difference when you look at what type of skills you'll be looking under each of those labels. So core skills that are going to continue to be important to the organization's long-term goals probably still sit in the permanent workforce. Those that are specialized or emerging or around capacity spikes or filling gaps on an interim, they lend themselves more suitably to freelance. But I think there's a piece of research by Beamery I read that said that 71% of workers perform work outside of their job description. So I think that shows that even though the processes are the same, there's more license in how you bring people into permanent workforce, potentially because it's a bigger scale. It's organizational scale versus project scale or team scale. So you can maybe take a bit more license with what that person does or things that they take on outside of their scope. But as all of these things contract around companies in the current market and budgets become tighter, the level of which you're overstaffed continues to drop down. I think it's only good practice that you're being tighter around how you consider talent from a permanent perspective as you do from a freelance perspective.
Yeah, and I think the CIPD recently said that in 2024, the top of most CTOs' agenda was reducing headcount and cost, right? And I think, when that happens, usually the reliance on freelancers becomes higher, right? And I think if you are to maintain your level of kind of, service to whether it's a service client or kind of the skills that you have in the business, you need to make sure that you are assessing the freelancers on a very similar scale, if not the same, or maybe even harsher, right? Because I think with permanent recruitment, the way that you would look at, or assess interviews when you are looking for a permanent person is you might say that they're kind of there, but we are willing as a business to get them where we want them to be. I think, when it comes to skills-based hiring and freelance recruitment, a lot of people really have a higher bar because they're saying, right, well, okay, if we're doing this on a short term and we're looking for this person to specifically come with this set skill set, then we need them to be above where we would expect someone to come in permanently because we just don't think we're going to have the time to upskill them, right? You're kind of bringing in that skill. You're buying something specifically as opposed to investing in the person. Now, whether that's true or not is yet to be decided. As I say, kind of the gap between permanent members of staff and freelancers sometimes can be really close together. But ultimately, I think that is the lens that's viewed really quite commonly. which presents a challenge for sure. But I think that's definitely sometimes a key indicator of whether you're looking for freelancers. And just one more point, I think, the key thing here is speed. I think when you're looking for a freelancer and you're looking for a permanent person, the separation here is that you can look for active and passive candidates in both sides. But those passive candidates require a lot of care when you're looking for freelancers because they do lots of gigs, right? Passive candidates in the permanent market may just be in a job, right? It just means that they might be interested in your brand, but they're in a job. So you can have a conversation with them anytime. In order to keep up to date with your freelancers, you kind of need to keep in communication with them or have your brand reach them at any given moment so they understand what's happening. So I think that high touch approach from any talent team is really required, which is why there's usually a heavy reliance on staffing agencies outside of internal teams to do that. But I really see speed as really the only key difference here.
Yeah, really, really interesting observations, you two. I think, we generally get the vibe that, there's a lot of similarity, there's a lot of overlap between sort of from a recruiter's perspective as to, the freelancer or full-time, but there are like important differences. As you mentioned, someone who's like fully freelance, let's say they self-identify as a freelancer, so they haven't episodically decided to do a gig in between a perm job, but they're on the sort of freelancer market space. They obviously will have cycle through lots of projects because they're not going to be doing 5-10 year projects. Probably it's going to be 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, something like this. Therefore, your recruitment sort of communication needs to sort of address that cadence. They're going to be probably more sensitive to opportunities being shown to them simply because they're going to be more kind of aware that they're always thinking of their own pipeline in terms of work. Whereas you can overdo that with a permanent candidate. I mean, we all know that if you have a great candidate, they're happy to be in your talent community, etc. Maybe the worst thing you can do is keep shoving jobs at them. Because they've said to you, hey, I'm happy to be in the community. It doesn't mean I'm like actively looking at this point. So we need to be aware as to, what the psychology of the candidate is, what the self-identity is, how often they cycle through job opportunities. That's something where technology's got to help us with, hasn't it? Because if we just put a big label on someone's face head to head to say freelancer or permanent, that's not going to give us enough nuance to understand actually, how quickly is this person moving through different job opportunities. You might be able to see someone who's starting their freelancer career start accelerating the numbers of jobs they take as they go through it, and maybe even decelerate if they go back in-house and work into a different company. So our ability to then moderate our communication style is really important. Which kind of moves us on to, on the tech side, like the title of this talk is what freelance operations and technology. So, where is the tooling with managing sort of a freelancer pipeline, CRM, all that type of stuff? Where are we in general state of play? Back in my day, it would literally be the recruiter, typically a recruitment agent, and it would be totally on that person. And oftentimes that's like in the person's head. Who's available. It's like nothing documented, never mind digitized. So where are we now in terms of technology and tech? What's available for people to use?
Yeah, I think, look, technology is there to enhance any of the experience of, a touch point with any logo with a talent, a person who wants to work with that business. And I think ultimately, right now, there are various different tools out there on the market, obviously, like Worksome, and I will fly that flag, of course. But I think, talent teams do a lot in order to create really strong EVPs for their brands that they work for. And I think what technology can do is really speed up that process, because we've just identified that speed is a massive key area that needs to be the variation between permanent hiring and freelance hiring. So without technology, you can't do things quickly, right? If you're using technology, but then there is a point where you can overuse technology, right? If you've got various different pieces of tech that are pulling in, be it marketplace, be it even just email, just pulling in to really dilute that experience in the EVP that you've created or set at the beginning of the year to then flow through, I think that can sometimes really be a hindrance for it. But right now, I think there are some really cool pieces of tech on the market that can enhance that speed, create efficiency, remove friction from the process, and create consistency. And that's what everyone's trying to do on the permanent hiring side. And I think in 2025, I'm hearing more that people are starting to really talk about freelance hiring. So with technology, they can create the consistency that they want to be able to do from the top all the way through. It creates trust in the business.
All right, quick question to Dan. I'm a recruiter, I'm sitting there. Do I want to have two separate systems handling a freelancer population and then a full-time worker population? Or are we there yet with tooling that actually we should commingle that and it's a single tool? Where do you stand on it as a consultant? You're advising a customer, for instance, and they're asking that question. What would you say to them?
I would love to be there right now. I don't think the market is there. I got sent a graphic this week of skills tech providers, and there were over 50. And I think we're at that point of like proliferation, and the market will come back, and it will come back in terms of simplification, integration, like joined up end-to-end experience. So from a personal point of view, from what I've seen during my journey and what I would be advising at the moment to other people is that it's probably two systems, or at least streamlined versions of the two, because as we've talked about, the process is the same, but it's just how you're executing that, and I think it does. There are sort of differences that will need to be addressed, and that's particularly when you come back to like talent relationship management. It's the fact that you're going to someone again and again, and they become like your private network, as it were. That's your external bench, because you can't carry that internally anymore, and that's a different question that you're asking of people each time. It's a different value proposition that you're trying to add. It's not just, here's a transaction, here's a job, there's some money, and the system becomes, how do we pay you for that? The system becomes, well, how do we create a way of you interacting with this company that feels good, that either gives you messages at some point, gives you alerts at other points, gives you payment at other points. I think getting to a point where you have a system that can deal with the breadth of what an individual needs and also what an organization needs is what we're working to. They're slightly separated at the moment, but if we have this conversation in a couple of years, there'll probably be a lot more overlap.
Yeah. What needs to be done on the product side for it to be a fully sort of integrated system, Jacob? You got any thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I don't have any immediate thoughts on it. I'm not too sure. I think they are different beasts, right? Freelance and permanent hiring as you go down the chain. I think freelance hiring has such, such risk attached to it, quite frankly. If I look at kind of our competitors at Worksome, if I talk to a prospect, they may have five systems that are effectively doing what Worksome can provide. And that's right the way from sourcing through to compliance, through to payments. Sometimes that can create just a bedrock of technology that they just, unfortunately, have to try to control in one place. And I think, does permanent hiring need that? No. So, it's a very different challenge that you're trying to solve from a technological point of view. What's missing? I'm not too sure right now, but what I do understand is just how important the freelance side is, whether it's the paying of the freelancer, whether it's, de-risking the business from an IR35 standpoint or whatever that may be in the certain region. But from a permanent hiring perspective, it's more really front end. It's more sourcing. ATSs are really quite good at being able to tag things, understand, screen things quickly, have good communication, whether that's templates, get through a plethora of applications very, very quickly, as well as talk to your business and store things like interviews. They don't require that. They don't require the risk side. They don't require the payment side. So would it be a benefit of a business to blur the two? I don't know.
Yeah, really, really good concept. We can sometimes be obsessed with over integration, so to say. He feels like a mecca, but these days it may well be that certain bits of data might stay slightly separated. We're heading towards a world where maybe the interface becomes more of a conversation in any case. So there might be an argument to say, actually, you've got a single interface for multiple systems, and that would be the outcome that we're looking at toward the end. And by the way, we should also recognize that a lot of the systems that recruiters use have been optimized for the full-time permanent work. As part of the problem is, you look at your standard ATS, all of the default configurations, the default fields, they're all based on the fact that there's going to be a full-time worker, probably on site. We often wrestle with, recruiters have been hacking around that system for a long time, trying to figure out how to fit people in. But what we obviously either need is a specialist system to handle someone with a bit that operates in a bit more flexible way, or indeed a system itself that is more flexible, sort of within sort of how a recruiter wants to work. All of this, by the way, diving into a deeper sort of philosophical point of view, is basically looking at where the company starts and where the company ends. The barrier, the distinction between a company and the market is starting to become more permeable. So in other words, what does it mean when you have a freelancer that kind of flows in and out of your company repeatedly over time? Is he part of your company? I would say many cases, yes. They may have institutional knowledge in excess of a lot of people that are permanently in your company. However, they may not be contractually employed by you, and may never have been. So it challenges a lot of our kind of preconceptions as to what a company is vis-a-vis what a market is. So it's very exciting in my opinion, because we need to recognize also that a great deal of the growth of the alternative workforce is also from the candidates themselves. Dan, I dare say you're an example. You're in a personal sense, preferring to work, let's say, as an independent worker, rather than be in a bureaucracy that may no longer suit your interest, no longer suit your particular passion. So I think there's lots of reasons why there's a growth of the freelancer interim type of marketplace. In fact, I saw some research from a French market earlier today, which looked at TA professionals and in the French market, and there was a significant spike of individuals operating as talent acquisition specialists on the interim market rather than in permanent. Now, arguably, some of that may be push, some of it might be pull, but perhaps the outcome is still going to end up in the same place, where we have expertise that wants to deliver that expertise, but perhaps not optimally as a full-time worker anymore. You no longer want to do that. Dan, let's dive into that as I've invoked you. What are the benefits from a freelancer perspective? Like, what do you think is good about it? And maybe we can also kind of contextualize that with what is potentially a risk or a con about that lifestyle that people need to be aware of before they embark on it.
So, plot spoiler, I'm going to go back into the permanent workforce next year. But to your point, I think what the last 2 years have shown me is there is more permeability between organization, individual, type of engagement. Do you have a career in one company, or do you have a portfolio career? Do you do things for a time box period of time? And I've learned to be more comfortable with that ambiguity. The amazing thing that I found was the control over my own time, and the breadth of conversations, from knowing this this vertical very well, to having to talk to that and being inspired about the breadth of those conversations was amazing. You then have all of that infrastructure that protects you or insulates you from the peaks and troughs taken away. So you are the organization. And when business development goes well, you go well. When the market doesn't support that in the same way, you feel it. So from an individual point of view, it's more cyclical, which fits with the nature of why organizations use freelance as well. It's a cyclical nature to it. There's a rhythm to it. And I think it works for some people for a time, it works for some people forever. But I think working out what it is that you do, articulating that, being very clear on that and how to sell that from the individual side. And then on the flip side, being very clear on what you're looking for, how you're going to assess that coming into an organization. Those two things have to be sharper. Jacob mentioned it earlier. Freelance is all about speed, the speed to productivity. So if your CVP or your brand means that you have a bunch of people who know how you work, who identify with your vision, with the things that you hold important, you're already halfway there in terms of productivity. I think being able to use that to greater organizational success is an amazing thing. So I think speed is a big thing around freelance, but it just means that you have to be much tighter on what your individual proposition is and the organizational one.
Yeah, so it may make you. It sounds like it'll also make you a stronger employee, to employers coming in, simply because you're not like sloping into a new job thinking, yeah, I've got this long period of ramp. Actually, you're coming in thinking, right, I'm all business. So really interesting. There's obviously a famous Jeff Bezos quote about sort of decisions being like one door or two door, or two-way door, a one-way door. And the idea is, look, if it's a two-way door, basically it's a reversible decision. And what I'm hearing, one of the great benefits of this alternative workforce for both the employee and the sort of employer and the candidate, is that its optionality is actually quite high. Like there's no reason to think you're defined in this way, one way or the other. The relationship that you have with your employer is subject to negotiation. And it could be either way. We're going to be a lot more flexible generally. And I think, I can imagine a future scenario where we're going down skills-based hiring, but we then have the conversation, in what manner or what contractual relationship do we want to start with? And then we can negotiate a position which makes sense for both parties, particularly if all of the logistics is sorted out. So going to you on this, Jake, one of the aversions that people might have to hiring alternative workforces, but how the devil do we pay this person? How do we know they're compliant? Oh, I see they're actually living in that country and there's a remote job, it's fine, but how do we even deal with it given the fact that they operate in a different place? How has technology supported that decision making? Because I think with that type of additional thought process, you can imagine a lot of recruiters just thinking, right, that's a headache, I'm skipping, I'm going to keep looking for a perm guy.
Yeah, and I think really, around the technology, there's a lot out there. Earlier when I was talking about the competitors for Worksome, for example, I think whether it's we need to hire someone in Spain, so therefore, and we're a UK-based company, what do we do? Right, so we normally have a conversation internally. We spend a lot of time saying, how do we do this? And then we go out to the market. And usually what clients do is they'll either just offload that problem to a staffing agency, because they would have done the research and they will already be kind of working with people like EOR partners and systems that can provide that compliance. But I think the end-to-end process is complex, right? And it's not just as simple as going to find talent, as you say, Hung. Like you've got to pay them, you've got to make sure it's compliant. And there's various systems out there that can do parts of this stuff, but maybe not all of it, or all of it very well. Maybe it does 25% of what we would need. And I think given the complex nature of freelance, because it can just depend, there's never a kind of straight answer to some things. It can be dependent on, if we want to hire Jacob Williams, and the responsibilities may change mid-contract, you may need to go back to your system like a Worksome that could potentially rerun something like an SDS to determine the outcome of whether that is compliant. Technology is there to definitely help, but I think it's such a complex space that sometimes there can be a lot of it. And it's trying to maintain that consistent approach to make sure that you are, one, de-risked, and two, removing friction from the process.
Yeah, I think that's super important. I think that's probably the role of the vendor, isn't it? To be able to make those concerns go away. You've got to reduce the risk on behalf of the employing organization. If you can provide like, compliance as default, if you can you sort of do all of that, make the payments headache go away. All of those things are critically important for it to be a real practical decision for an employer to make.
For sure. I mean, even for example, with Worksome, we are a software, right? Worksome is a platform, but we're a platform with a heartbeat because of the complexity of it. There are so many people in this business that our clients can rely on in order to talk through the situations, because they can be so complex. I don't think that we will ever get to a state in which technology can solve all of the problems for the freelance market. There will always be a, well, what about this question, or definitely a conversation for sure.
Yeah, very interesting. Folks, I'm going to switch to the idea of, a scenario. Company is keen to increase the non-FTE component of their workforce for whatever reason that may be, controlling costs, organizational agility, workforce on demand, etc. And they want to get started. What's your advice on how they do that? They may have popped in one or two contractors on a buy and buy, but they didn't really want to kind of properly do it at scale at some point. What is your advice? Dan, I've got to go to you, given the fact you've been presumably providing that advice over the last couple of years. New company trying to move into a more diversified workforce. What kind of things do they need to know and do? First things first.
I think we talked about a lot this in a broader context, this call, but just be clear on what skills you're bringing in, where you'll find them. There are sub-marketplaces now like Gigged. There are communities like freelancing support. Just be very intentional about what, where, how you'll assess them. We talked about integration quickly. So it is having a more streamlined plan for it than your permanent workforce, and just keeping a record as you go, because that becomes your competitive advantage, that becomes your network, that becomes your bench. And I have to say that, because of compliance, insurance, indemnity, I work with a partner. If you're getting to that point of repeatable, scalable freelancing, it takes a lift off, it takes a headache off. So depending on where you are in terms of volume, that'd be something to look at.
Jacob, advice. I mean, coming from vendor side, you're looking at companies that are probably investigating Worksome first time. What do you kind of analyze? Say, okay, this company's ready now, or that company needs to do ABC before they, before they can make a success of the plan that they have.
Yeah, I mean, I echo what Dan said around, make sure that you're definitely doing your research and working with the right partners. I think, it can be really risky when you're going into the freelance market, and working with the right people to make sure that the right decisions are being made are really, really super important, right? From a legal perspective, right? We're talking about the law and legislation here. It's not just kind of strategy. But then equally, that's kind of the risk side and the payment side. But at the beginning part, when it comes to sourcing, be playful, be curious, be innovative. I think no one has ever cracked hiring, right? That's just not possible. What works for your business may not work for another. Don't be afraid to make mistakes when it comes to the sourcing perspective, and making sure that you're getting out there into the market and seeing what's right for you. Listen to others, learn from others. And I mention it all the time. Freelance hiring is sometimes usually plan B for a permanent person. And now that's shifting to being plan A, and people are building key strategies around that. Everyone can build a strategy if you're a chief talent officer, but the best CTOs are playful and innovative. So do that. Rely on the experts for where you need the expert knowledge, and rely and trust yourself at the kind of sourcing stage and the strategic part to just build something right for you.
Yeah, very, very interesting. A couple of questions floating in from outside of this sort of webinar experience. I just want to chuck it at you, Jacob. From a kind of a person that's working remotely, how do you sort of address right to work? I guess here we're talking about UK context, but potentially this could be anywhere. I think it looks like even in the US particularly, there's going to be more pressure on making sure you're hiring documented workers, etc. All this type of stuff might fall on the employer to make sure of that compliance. They're going to lean on a tool like Worksome. How do you solve this problem for companies?
Yeah, I think, look, when it comes to right to work and any kind of checks, right, whether that's, CRB or DBS, whatever, right to work, then we would just go through the processes that we are required to legally, and we would make sure that those things are happening, they're logged, they're registered, and therefore they are stored in one place. And I think, the key part here is checks can be different company to company, but usually what happens is people do their checks right at the beginning, right, in an onboarding process. And then when it comes to needing them, it's usually about 12 months down the line. And I guess that's usually the tricky part is everyone can perform these checks, whether it's the business themselves and their HR team, or it's your partner that you work with. But it's about where are they? Are they searchable? Are they viewable at the drop of a hat? Are they within a system that is easily used? That's the messy part. That's usually the real messy part.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Dan, just go back to you on this, on the question of compliance issues, remote working, stuff like this. Are there any sort of mitigation factors here or is it just going to inherently come with some sort of risk that, employers have got to kind of expand their risk appetite, so to say, when we are looking to also expand the, interim or alternative workforce?
I think some employers have taken a very risk-averse view where they've said no freelancers or at least no engagements outside R35. I generally and genuinely don't see freelance as a risky option. Hiring anybody into your business, you go even permanently, you go through employment legislation, you go through right to work from a visa perspective, you should do background checks or take references. Like there's all of this, but I think that's become normalized. Whereas anything that's a bit different or a change just becomes bigger in terms of its perception, but it's not bigger in terms of scale. It's just in terms of the lack of knowledge or comfort with it changes people's perception of it. And I think part of the education around freelance is of the value of freelance itself, not just the process. So we're talking about, the question before was around like how to get started. That model of like you adopt something, you prove it, you expand it. I think that for TA leaders working in freelance that are looking to help their organization embrace that more is a good approach, because it's not trying to conquer the world. It's not trying to, or from a skills-based perspective, you're not trying to map the taxonomy of your whole organization from the beginning. It's like, what can we do now? What do we feel comfortable with? Then the bar of comfort gets raised and you go again.
Yeah, and within the TA function itself, we're probably going to see more a mix of people going forward rather than just a block of full-time workers working in a department. Every department will probably see an increase of people that are not full-time. And in fact, we may even start removing those mental sort of binaries out of moving those binaries out of our minds and just say, look, we've got a bunch of people working on this direction. And there's a mix of contractual relationships we have with those folks. So yes, very, very interesting indeed. Okay, folks, we're coming to the end of this show. Thanks for watching, everybody. It's been really educational. I think there's so much more to go. And this is a kind of a future direction. I think it's one of these has a sense of inexorability about it. And I think there's lots of positive things we can take from this direction of increased flexibility, plus mass sort of using a skills-based hiring to get there. I think this future is going to look more agile, look more flexible. I think a little more interesting also for both employer and worker alike. Jake, let me leave you with the final couple of words. I think you've got an offer you want to make to the audience here, so take it away.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're doing an offer today for organizations that are using 10 or more freelancers on a monthly basis. So if I believe there is a link that you guys can click now to book in some time for myself. And effectively what we'll do is a one-to-one session to assess your skills-based hiring readiness. So we can talk about everything that we've discussed today and really make it specific for your company.
Okay, folks, that's a wonderful, we'll wrap it right here. Make sure you kind of follow on from Worksome, by the way. They do very regularly webinars like this. I think they're super educational. I massively endorse companies, taking some space on the internet to talk about areas of their expertise. For us as recruiters, we do have access to all of this information without cost. These days, I think you've got to just embrace all of this good stuff that you're given. Fantastic stuff here. Okay, folks, that's it. Well, we'll let you go now. Thanks for watching, everybody.
Thanks, guys.